60 million people. That is roughly how many lives were extinguished in a conflict that began with a single act of aggression and ended with the world irrevocably rearranged. Before you dismiss this as another history lesson, consider this. The phones in our pockets, the borders on our maps, the alliances that keep nations from war today, and even the very idea of human rights as a global concept, all of it traces back to 6 years of devastation that most people only remember in fragments. This is not just the story of battles and generals. It is a story of how humanity nearly destroyed itself, and in doing so, rebuilt the entire world order from the ashes. What happened between 1939 and 1945 did not just end a war. It ended an era, and nothing that came after would ever be the same. To understand how the world arrived at such catastrophe, it helps to look back at the wreckage left by an earlier war, one that was supposed to end all wars. The First World War had already redrawn empires, toppled monarchies, and left millions dead across the trenches of Europe. Yet instead of lasting peace, the treaties that followed sowed resentment, particularly in Germany, where economic collapse and national humiliation created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Historians such as Ian Kershaw, whose biographies of Adolf Hitler remain among the most respected academic accounts of the period, have documented how a fragile democracy in interwar Germany gave way to authoritarian rule within little more than a decade. This was not an accident in history. It was a product of economic desperation, political fragmentation, and a population searching for someone to blame. By the time Hitler consolidated power in the 1930s, the machinery of a new and far more destructive war was already being assembled. Rearmament accelerated, propaganda reshaped public perception, and across the globe, other nations watched with a mixture of caution and denial, hoping that appeasement might prevent another catastrophic conflict. It did not. On the 1st of September, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland, and within days, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun, though few at the time could have imagined the scale of destruction that awaited. What followed was not a single war, but a series of interconnected campaigns spanning nearly every continent. In Europe, the German military employed a strategy known as Blitzkrieg, a rapid and coordinated assault combining air power, armored divisions, and infantry that overwhelmed nations in weeks rather than years. France, despite its formidable military reputation, fell in just over a month. Britain stood largely alone, enduring the relentless bombing campaign known as the Blitz, during which cities like London absorbed nightly assaults that killed tens of thousands of civilians. Winston Churchill's wartime speeches, preserved in official archives and widely studied by historians, became symbols of defiance during Britain's darkest hours, rallying a nation that many believe was on the brink of invasion. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, a different and equally devastating theater of war was unfolding. Japan's imperial ambitions had already led to brutal campaigns in China throughout the 1930s, but it was the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 that transformed the conflict into a truly global war. The United States, previously reluctant to enter the fighting directly, mobilized its industrial and military might almost overnight. Factories that once produced automobiles began manufacturing tanks and aircraft at a scale the world had never witnessed. This industrial transformation would prove decisive, not only in defeating the Axis powers, but in establishing the United States as an economic superpower whose influence would define the following decades. As the war expanded, so did its horrors. The Eastern Front, where Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in 1941, became the deadliest theater in human history. Estimates suggest that the Soviet Union alone lost more than 20 million people, both military and civilian, in a campaign marked by brutal sieges, mass starvation, and scorched earth tactics on both sides. The Battle of Stalingrad, in particular, is often cited by historians as a turning point, where Soviet forces, despite catastrophic losses, managed to encircle and ultimately defeat the German Sixth Army. This defeat marked the beginning of a long and grinding Soviet advance westward that would eventually reach Berlin itself. Yet even as military campaigns raged, a separate and unimaginable tragedy was unfolding behind the front lines. The Holocaust, The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, including Roma people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and prisoners of war, represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. This genocide, meticulously documented through survivor testimonies, wartime records, and post-war tribunals, such as the Nuremberg trials, was not incidental to the war, but central to the ideology that drove it. Institutions like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem in Israel continue to preserve this history, ensuring that the scale of this atrocity is neither forgotten nor minimized. Understanding the war without understanding the Holocaust is to understand only half the story. By 1944, the tide had begun to turn decisively against the Axis powers. The D-Day landings in Normandy, launched on the 6th of June, represented one of the largest amphibious military operations ever conducted. Allied forces, drawn from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations, stormed the beaches of northern France in an operation meticulously planned under immense secrecy. Historians and documentarians, including those behind acclaimed productions like Ken Burns' The War, have chronicled how this single day marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe, though the fighting that followed remained brutal and costly for nearly another year. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west, Germany's collapse became increasingly inevitable. Berlin fell in the spring of 1945, and Hitler's death by suicide in his bunker marked the symbolic end of Nazi Germany. Yet the war in the Pacific continued for several more agonizing months. It was here that the conflict reached its most controversial and consequential turning point. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, resulting in immediate and long-term casualties estimated in the hundreds of thousands. This decision remains one of the most debated moments in modern history. Some historians argue it hastened Japan's surrender and prevented a costlier invasion, while others contend that Japan was already nearing capitulation through diplomatic channels. Both perspectives are supported by credible historical scholarship, and neither should be presented as definitive fact, but rather as part of an ongoing and important historical debate. When Japan formally surrendered in September 1945, the war finally came to an end, but its conclusion did not bring simple peace. It brought a new world order entirely. The devastation across Europe and Asia necessitated an unprecedented rebuilding effort. The United States, largely untouched physically by the war compared to its allies, emerged as an economic and military superpower. The Soviet Union, despite its staggering losses, emerged as the other dominant global power, setting the stage for decades of ideological confrontation known as the Cold War. The very structure of international relations shifted permanently, giving rise to institutions like the United Nations, founded in 1945 specifically to prevent future conflicts of such magnitude through diplomacy and collective security. The war also reshaped colonial empires that had dominated global politics for centuries. Weakened European powers found it increasingly difficult to maintain their overseas territories, accelerating independence movements across Asia and Africa in the decades that followed. India's independence in 1947, for instance, can be understood partly through the lens of a British Empire financially and militarily exhausted by 6 years of total war. In this sense, the Second World War did not just end a conflict between nations. It dismantled and rebuilt the global political architecture that had existed for generations. Beyond geopolitics, the war fundamentally altered how humanity understood morality, justice, and collective responsibility. The Nuremberg trials established, for the first time in history, that individuals could be held legally accountable for crimes against humanity, even when acting under orders from a state. This legal precedent continues to influence international law and human rights frameworks to this day. Documentaries and historical analyses, including works featured by the BBC and the Imperial War Museum, have extensively explored how these trials shaped modern concepts of justice on a global scale. Technologically and scientifically, the war accelerated innovations that continue to shape our lives. Advances in aviation, medicine, computing, and nuclear physics, many originally developed for military purposes, eventually found civilian applications that transformed everyday life. The very foundations of modern computing, for instance, owe much to code-breaking efforts undertaken by figures like Alan Turing at Bletchley Park in Britain, work that remained classified for decades, but is now recognized as pivotal not only to the war's outcome, but to the digital age that followed. Perhaps most importantly, the war left behind a collective memory that continues to shape how nations interact with one another. The phrase "never again," born from the horrors of the Holocaust and the broader devastation of global conflict, became a guiding principle for international diplomacy, however imperfectly upheld in the decades since. Memorials, museums, and educational curricula across the world continue to ensure that new generations understand not just the events of the war, but the human cost behind every statistic. When we look back now, from the distance of more than 80 years, it becomes clear that this was not simply a war between nations vying for territory or power. It was a conflict that forced humanity to confront the very depths of its own capacity for destruction, while simultaneously inspiring extraordinary acts of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. The world that emerged afterward was neither perfect nor free from conflict, as subsequent decades of Cold War tension and regional wars would prove. But was a world reshaped by the lessons, however painfully learned, of what happens when hatred, nationalism, and unchecked power are allowed to spiral unchecked. Perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of this war. Not simply the borders it redrew or the institutions it created, but the sobering reminder it left behind that peace is not a permanent